Hey guys, Danny Johnson here, and today we're talking about the two-valve Mustang GT engine. The things I like about it, the things I dislike about it, some of the problems that it has, and disclaimer, I own the GT, the Mach 1, and the Cobra, so I own one of each. I don't hate any of them, but we're just going to discuss a few things. So just to clarify, when we talk about valves, we're talking about intake and exhaust valves in the cylinder heads. So here, for example, is a 4-valve per cylinder engine, like you would have in the Cobra, and it has 2 intake valves on the top and 2 exhaust valves on the bottom. So on the back side of these valves, you would have a camshaft operating the intake valves and another camshaft operating the bottom valves. So you have an intake cam and an exhaust cam. So that's what a dual overhead cam engine would look like here with 4 valves per cylinder. So the 2-valve is 1 camshaft operating 1 exhaust valve and 1 intake valve. So this is a single overhead cam engine. There is 1 camshaft going across the top of each cylinder head. In 1996, when the 4.6 liter came out, it was only 215 horsepower for the 2-valve in the Mustang GT, which was quite behind the Camaro's 275. Now, the 2-valve wasn't too bad on torque. It was 285 pound-feet, and the Camaro was a lot higher, 325 pound-feet. Now, when you look at the intake ports on the cylinder heads, it almost looks like Ford was purposely restricting them. So on the right, you see what is now referred to as NPI, or non-performance improved. So 1996 to 1998 had circular intake ports that were quite small. As you see on the left, you have now the performance improved, or PI heads, that came out from 1999 through 2004. And you can see they're squared off and just a much better opening. So with those improvements, the engine was now boosted up to 260 horsepower and 302 pound-feet of torque. So keep in mind, even though the Mustang was a little bit behind Chevrolet, it was still a pretty good output engine for the year. This is 1999 technology we're talking about with 260 horsepower and 302 pound-feet of torque. And I really like that they put the running horse up on the intake plenum. It was a really nice touch. I really like the overall layout and look of this engine. The alternator's up front. It's very easy to service. However, there are a few things and small problems with this engine, and I've had to deal with all of them. The first would be that this intake manifold, as you can see, was a composite where it was metal and plastic. And so the plastic will crack, and you'll actually get coolant spilling out of where the coolant would be passing through the intake manifold at the very front here. And it does that on both sides. You get coolant down in the valley. Got to change it anyway because it's plastic that's been broken. But you have coolant passages on both sides here of the intake manifold, on the front and the back. And so that's something I really, over time, didn't care for, especially when you compare it to the 32-valve setup. Now, by comparison, on the 32-valve engine, you see that you have a coolant crossover tube in the front, and that just goes directly down into the cylinder head. So there is no intake manifold problems of leaking. It's very sealed and very nice. And of course, this has a supercharger as the intake manifold per se. But even on the 32-valve Mach 1 and the 99 or 2001 Cobra, for example, it's the same setup where you have a intake manifold with no coolant going through it. And so it's the same thing, has a crossover tube, and it just goes into the cylinder head. So it's really nice for long term. You're not going to have coolant leaks. You're not going to have the intake manifold crack and spill and have to seal it and all that kind of thing. Now, a common problem with the 2-valve engine, and also on the 4-valve for most of them, you can spit the spark plug right out of the cylinder head. People think it's from the piston hitting it, but that's really not the case. It's just the fact that the cylinder heads only have 4 threads for the spark plug to screw into, and so if they're loose at all, or if they're too tight, that pressure just from the cylinder pressure can pop them out. And so you'll see a lot of people talking about a helicoil or a time cert in order to repair that. But that is something that is common on these engines. Now, the position of the spark plugs as well isn't particularly ideal, because when you do have coolant coming out of the intake manifold when it cracks, it does drain into the spark plug holes from the top. So that's one thing the 2-valve probably could have been designed a little bit better with. The 4-valve dual overhead cam engine has these little plates here that go over the cam covers, and the spark plugs and coil packs are underneath that. But mainly, any kind of moisture or anything is not going to leak down into the spark plugs that way. If you do have any kind of a coolant leak, or even just too much rainwater or anything that's getting in there. But it really isn't that bad of a design on both the single overhead cam or the dual overhead cam for the 4.6. The spark plugs are very accessible up top, very easy to change out. On pushrod engines, by contrast, sometimes you have to go between the exhaust manifolds just to get to the plugs. And while we're talking about the pushrod engine, it also is typically 2 valves per cylinder as well. Now, the next item of business for the 2-valve engine is the connecting rod. I really wish they would have done a stronger rod. Naturally aspirated, you're really not going to have any problem with it. It'll hold about 450 rear wheel horsepower, about 500 engine horsepower. So, I mean, it's fine for what it is, but you start boosting the car, you're going to start to have some problems, and even the coating on the pistons will start to wear off a little bit, and you get a little bit of piston slap sound until they heat up and expand. But you compare the connecting rod to the Terminator rods, which is a forged H-beam rod, you can definitely tell a difference. Now, of course, that's Terminator only. The Mach 1 and the 9901 Cobra has the same rod, basically, so they're not very strong in general, unless you do get the Terminator rod, which is why that engine was built so well. And I have a full video on that, and I'll put a link to that in the video description. The compression ratio on the GTs really aren't bad too. It's in the 9.5 range, and so you can see it has some little dish here in the top of the piston. The Terminator rod, by comparison, or the Terminator piston actually, has more dish in the top and a lower compression ratio. So as far as compression ratios go, 9.5 isn't really too bad for the GT. Ford pushed it a little higher with the Mach 1. They went to 10-1, which really helped with the output. And the Terminator, of course, they dropped it down to 8.5-1 just because it was supercharged and they wanted to be conservative with the boost pressure. Now, the 2-valve engine, being single overhead cam, it does rev pretty good, up to 5,800 RPM, but it's pretty much running out of steam around there, where the dual overhead cam engines are a little bit higher on the red line. From 58, the Cobra goes to 6,500, and the Mach 1 even 6,800, being not supercharged. They're letting you spin it a little higher. And valve train has a lot to do with how high that red line will be. And I just noticed between the cars, it just seems that where the GT kind of stops, the Mach 1 or the Cobra will just keep going as far as into those higher RPM ranges. You feel the GT start to flatten out and kind of die off, and where it stops, the 4-valve just comes alive. And of course, you're kind of cheating with the Terminator being supercharged. Now, granted, every engine will have some problems. The alternators go out pretty often on them as well. You can see there's a brand new one here on my car. And the reality, though, is a huge advantage of this engine is that you can go pick up the same engine in the Crown Vic and the Grand Marquis and really get a low mileage babied engine that's identical as far as all the internals are concerned. So my brother right now is actually making some videos on a GT he picked up. He got a Grand Marquis engine that was just low mileage, grocery getter, beautiful engine. And once you remove the valve covers, the exhaust manifolds, the intake manifold, swap everything back over, internally, it is the exact same engine. So they're very readily available. They're all over the place. They're cheap. They're $500 or $600. I mean, for the cost that it would, you'd repair a cylinder head or do anything like that, you can just go pick up a nice low mileage, good engine, and they're very reliable. You know, I mean, they will last hundreds of thousands of miles. The 2-valve engine sounds very similar to the 4-valve, other than a little bit of a burble at idle and a higher RPM. The 2-valve is amazing sounding. This is my GT with off-road X-pipe and Borla stingers, And I just love daily driving this car. It's a great daily driver car. And that's another huge, awesome advantage of these cars is their daily drivable capability and low maintenance. The aftermarket is really big as well for the 2-valve. This is one of my personal favorites. My twin brother had the Torque Tech supercharger kit, which uses the 0304 Cobra's supercharger. He had a built bottom end to handle a little bit more power, but anyway, very impressive. These cars can be over 500 horsepower pretty easy, and just listen to it. Now, at the end of the day, guys, the truth is the 4-valve is definitely just a higher advanced, higher horsepower engine. So you can see the difference that the higher RPM makes with the dual overhead cam. The car just breathes a lot better, and you just have that better top end, so that's just ultimately the difference. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Again, I own both the 2-valve and the 4-valve. I'm going to tell you straight out, the 4-valve is a better engine. It's more powerful, a little more potential, but the 2-valve is still a great, reliable engine. It has a lot of good potential to it, just the same. So don't hate on it, and love it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please check out my other videos. I can put a whole playlist in the video description. And if you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe. If you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.